A thunderclap shook the corridors of global finance. At a European port, a shipment of gold worth $300 million, bound from Burkina Faso, was halted. No mechanical delay. It was politics, pure and simple. From behind the scenes came pressure from Washington, followed by a chilling message from former President Donald Trump. If Africa wants a seat at the table, it must pay the price. For most in the West, it was just another headline. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it was an earthquake. In Ouagadougou, a mother sat staring at a dark hospital ward where the gold was meant to fund electricity. In a village, a teacher wondered whether the school roof would ever be repaired. That gold was more than metal. It was medicine, education, and food security. Suddenly it was gone, and then came the voice of defiance. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, eyes unwavering, told his cabinet, "This is not debt. This is control." So here's the question. If a continent's future can be seized with a phone call, can it ever truly be free? Or is this the moment Africa draws the line and says, no more? If gold meant to heal the sick and feed the hungry can be frozen without warning, what else can be taken? If you believe dignity should never be held hostage, then let your voice count. Subscribe, not just to a channel, but to a truth that refuses to be buried. The gold was destined for schools, clinics, and food programs, but it never arrived. Instead, 300 million worth of Burkina Faso's gold was halted at a European port under the directive of unnamed Western powers. The justification: compliance with international financial obligations, an elegant phrase hiding a hard truth. This was no accident of paperwork. It was a calculated act. At the heart of the matter stood a silent weapon: the debt system. For years, Burkina Faso, and nations like it, had been required to service loans with interest rates reaching as high as 9%, while wealthy Western nations borrowed at less than 2%. The rules were clear: repay in dollars or face consequences. This time, the consequence came in the form of a seizure. The gold, meant to be traded for medical supplies, food reserves, and national infrastructure, was now locked behind foreign gates. In Ouagadougou, the impact was immediate. Government officials scrambled into emergency meetings. Economists warned the delay would derail fiscal plans. Newsrooms flooded with questions. But in the countryside, far from microphones and press releases, the emotional toll was even deeper. In the gold-rich town of Gaoua, a man named Alassane wiped sweat from his brow and stared at the earth he'd worked for 2 decades. A father of 4, he had helped dig the very gold now frozen thousands of miles away. "That gold was supposed to build a roof over my son's classroom," he said. "Now they say it belongs to someone else?" His wife Aisha, once hopeful that a nearby clinic would finally receive life-saving equipment, now walks miles to the river for clean water. The promise of development had been transformed into a memory. Cold, distant, and out of reach. Crowds gathered. Murals began appearing. Images of gold bars chained behind fences, and mothers holding empty plates beneath the phrase, "Debt is not destiny." In a local market, a woman selling fruit had painted a cardboard sign, "We mine. They seize." Who decides? It wasn't just protest. It was mourning. Mourning for a future interrupted by powers too far to see the faces behind the numbers. Behind the scenes, the message from the West was unmistakable. Deviate from IMF pathways. Explore alternatives like BRICS, and your lifelines will be cut. It was a financial warning shot, and the ripple was enormous. Not just in contracts and spreadsheets, but in the hearts of a nation already weary from promises unfulfilled. Teachers canceled classes in silent protest. A pastor in Bobo Dioulasso addressed his congregation with trembling voice. "When men dig gold and children go hungry, it is not justice. It is theft in daylight." His sermon spread quickly online, shared under the hashtag #OurGoldOurFuture. The government, under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, issued a statement condemning the seizure as economic aggression. But beyond diplomacy, a new tone emerged, one of moral urgency. "This is not about legality," a minister declared. "It is about ownership. Ownership of resources, ownership of destiny, ownership of pain and of hope." International analysts tried to downplay the incident, calling it regulatory friction. But for the families who needed that gold to pay for medicine, for fuel, for food, it was a message of cold indifference. "Regulations," Alassane muttered. "Don't feed my children." The seizure also exposed a deeper hypocrisy. While Burkina Faso was being penalized for seeking alternatives, Western companies operating in the region continued exporting minerals without disruption. Billions in resources flowed outward without delay, but when the government tried to redirect value inward, for hospitals, schools, or food security, the gates slammed shut. Across rural and urban areas alike, the realization set in: gold mined by Africans, destined to help Africans, could be stopped by foreign hands at any time. "What is sovereignty?" asked a university professor. "If a single phone call can cancel our future." And so, across every village and every city, a single question echoed louder with each passing hour. "If they can take our gold, what else will they take next?" But the gold was just the beginning. What followed would test not just the resolve of a leader, but the spirit of a nation willing to reclaim its future. It was not the language of compromise. Before a room filled with ministers and military officials, Captain Ibrahim Traoré spoke with precision and fire. "This is not debt. This is control," he declared, stripping away the complex jargon that often shields injustice behind legality. His words were not crafted for economists or diplomats. They were meant for farmers, for students, for miners, those whose labor had built the gold reserves now frozen beyond reach. The room fell silent, and then, as if carried by wind, those words echoed beyond the walls, carried into streets, classrooms, and homes across Burkina Faso. The response was immediate. Within hours of the speech, Ouagadougou's central square filled with people, not just protesters, but citizens. Miners still in their work clothes, students holding notebooks, elderly veterans carrying flags from the revolution. The chant was simple, thunderous, and relentless. "Our gold is not collateral. Our dignity is not for sale." It wasn't a riot. It was something more precise, more powerful, a movement rooted in history, but alive in the urgency of the present. Placards bore messages that struck at the heart of injustice. "They steal in daylight and call it law. Better hunger in freedom than bread in chains." One woman held a sign with a child's handprint and the words, "Gold can't buy back dignity once it's lost." And beneath it all ran a current of unyielding determination. Western media were quick to brand the demonstrations as signs of instability. Paris and London published headlines warning of unrest in the Sahel. But on the ground, the truth was visible in the faces of those gathered. This was not chaos. It was clarity. The diversity of the crowd was its greatest strength. Young entrepreneurs, fearful that foreign debt would crush their dreams, stood beside laborers who earned less than $3 a day. Mothers spoke of hospitals without medicine while pointing to the value of gold idling in foreign ports. University graduates shouted numbers into megaphones. $30 billion in interest payments Africa makes annually to foreign lenders. That money, they said, could power our homes, pave our roads, and cure our children. A retired school teacher stood at the front of the crowd, holding up his pension slip. "They told me we must sacrifice," he said, "but they sacrifice nothing. We mine the gold, they seize it, and then they tell us to be patient." As the crowd swelled, murals sprang up across city walls. Vaults carved into desert rock, painted hands clutching bars of gold, slogans sprayed in red. "Hold the gold, guard the future." Children used sidewalk chalk to write messages of hope and fury. And amid it all, a sense of something shifting. The streets were no longer just pathways. They had become places of testimony. In churches and mosques, religious leaders addressed the crisis not as political drama, but as a spiritual test. One pastor asked his congregation, "If we do not defend what is ours, can we say we have honored the blessings God has placed in our soil?" The crowd wept, not out of despair, but out of recognition. The protest soon expanded beyond Burkina Faso. Images were shared across borders, carried by social media, news outlets, and word of mouth. In Dakar, Bamako, Niamey, students began holding teach-ins, drawing maps of gold routes, questioning the logic of debt. Hashtags multiplied. Gold Ice Hours. Debt is not destiny. Sovereignty now. And then came the global response. Foreign commentators called Traore naive, emotional, dangerous. Editorials in Western newspapers painted him as a populist who would ruin his country. But the people heard something else in those accusations. They heard fear, not of instability, but of independence. One university lecturer put it best. They're not afraid that Traore will fail. They're afraid he'll succeed. That is what made the protests unstoppable. The knowledge that beyond the insults and editorials, something real had been awakened. Not just resistance, but a vision of a continent tired of being managed, ready to reclaim its narrative. As day turned to night, candles were lit across Ouagadougou, not in silence, but in defiance, not in mourning, but in memory of the gold that had become more than metal. It had become symbol, proof that something precious was being withheld, not just resources, but respect. Yet symbols, no matter how powerful, can be crushed. And as foreign powers shifted from economic pressure to more covert strategies, the question emerged. Could this movement survive the storm that was coming? Long after the protests quieted and the candles melted into the soil, the consequences remained. In Burkina Faso's remote villages, it was not rhetoric but rationing that defined daily life. With the 300 million gold shipment frozen, the national budget felt the weight of loss almost immediately. Fuel imports slowed, medical shipments were delayed, agricultural subsidies, vital during a difficult planting season, were cut by nearly 30%. The message from the international financial system had been loud, but the message on the ground was louder. Ordinary citizens were being forced to pay for a geopolitical power struggle they never chose. In the small town of Tenkodogo, a rural clinic ran out of insulin. A mother named Fatimata cradled her son, his breathing shallow. The medicine was supposed to arrive days ago, paid for by the sale of national gold. But with the funds frozen, no trucks came. "They say it's about rules," she whispered. "But rules don't save lives." In the capital, power outages grew more frequent. Government contracts for infrastructure projects stalled. Construction on a long-promised water purification plant was halted. Iron rods rusting in the sun as engineers were laid off. The civilian strain fed political tremors. Inside Parliament, opposition voices grew sharper. Some accused the government of provoking international retaliation. Others, more subtly, suggested that Burkina Faso should reconsider its alliances. But for many citizens, the blame did not fall on Traoré. It fell on a system that had demanded loyalty in exchange for suffering. "We've followed their conditions for decades," said a teacher in Kaya. "And we are still poor, still sick, still begging for what is ours." In response, Traoré's administration doubled down. Rather than retreat from his stance, the president called for national austerity, but framed it as sacrifice, not surrender. Ministers took pay cuts. Military convoys transported essential goods to isolated regions. Communities were encouraged to pool resources, creating local resilience networks. Food banks, fuel cooperatives, neighborhood clinics. The measures were imperfect, but symbolically powerful. This was not just crisis management. It was collective endurance. Yet tension remained. Smear campaigns began to surface in foreign media, alleging corruption within the Burkina Faso government. Anonymous sources whispered of discontent in military ranks. Leaked documents hinted at outside funding flowing into political opposition groups. While none of it was confirmed, the psychological pressure was clear. Divide, destabilize, delegitimize. But instead of fracturing, something unexpected occurred. In towns like Dori and Banfora, civilians formed neighborhood defense groups, not armed militias, but cooperative systems of resilience. Retired nurses ran mobile health tents. Former engineers offered free repairs to critical infrastructure. Farmers agreed to rotate crops for shared harvest. There was hardship, but also a kind of rebirth, a sense that the struggle, though painful, had revealed hidden strength. And there were victories. Local artisans began crafting water filtration systems using clay and sand. Low cost, effective, and made entirely within the country. Rural schools formed teaching collectives, allowing students to rotate between villages when supplies were scarce. The message was clear. If the world would deny them tools, they would make their own. But not all outcomes were hopeful. Emigration surged. Thousands, especially the young, left for Ivory Coast, Ghana, and beyond. They say it's about dignity, said one departing student. But I need a future too. That ache, of wanting both justice and opportunity, was perhaps the deepest wound of all. Still, political solidarity across the region was growing. The alliance of Sahel states, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger began formal discussions on resource-sharing treaties, regional emergency funds, and collective security measures. What had begun as national crisis was evolving into regional realignment. One diplomat called it the first draft of an African doctrine of financial independence. International observers were divided. Some warned that prolonged isolation could trigger collapse. Others noted that despite sanctions and financial pressure, the political will of the people remained unbroken. You can starve a government, one analyst admitted, but it's much harder to starve a population that has found purpose. And in the face of adversity, Traore's popularity, at least domestically, rose. Not because life had gotten easier, but because his defiance reflected a widely held truth, that poverty under pressure was still more honorable than prosperity bought in silence. For many, he had stopped being just a president. He had become a mirror of their own resilience. But as global institutions tightened their grip and whispers of sabotage grew louder, one question lingered in the air. Would Burkina Faso's moral victory be enough to withstand the full machinery of international power? From Washington, the message was crisp and unmistakable. If Africa wants a seat at the global trade table, it must play by IMF rules. The words, reportedly from former President Donald Trump, carried the full weight of decades of policy. But this time, the echo was different. It did not land as diplomacy. It landed as a warning, one that reverberated across Africa's political halls and economic circles. The seizure of $300 million in gold was not a financial hiccup. It was a line in the sand. For the International Monetary Fund, the crisis posed a unique threat. If Burkina Faso could sidestep dollar-denominated obligations and survive, it might encourage others to follow. Nations across the Sahel, already wary of IMF terms, watched closely. To the West, this was not just about a rebellious captain. It was about precedent. If one country succeeded in resisting the rules, the system itself could begin to unravel. In response, the United States and its allies tightened financial screws. Global insurance firms withdrew coverage for shipments involving Burkina Faso. Financial institutions flagged transactions for review. Credit ratings quietly dropped. It was financial warfare. No tanks, no troops, just leverage. But in the corridors of IMF offices, the concern was not just control. It was legitimacy. If nations began to view institutions like the IMF not as neutral brokers, but as tools of economic coercion, the foundation of the post-World War II financial order could be at risk. Meanwhile, in the East, The reaction was swift and strategic. India offered to purchase Burkina Faso's gold directly, bypassing European markets entirely. China and Russia proposed technology transfers, refining equipment that could turn raw ore into finished bars, increasing profits by up to 25%. BRICS leaders made statements affirming the right of nations to manage their resources. For once, Africa was not facing isolation. It was facing choice. The divergence was stark. On one side stood Western institutions, defending a model of trade tied to dollar discipline and structural adjustment programs. On the other side, a rising chorus of global powers offering alternatives, albeit not without their own interests. For Burkina Faso, the opportunity came with risk. Realignment could trigger harsher sanctions, media campaigns, and covert interference. But the potential reward, sovereignty over its own wealth, was too great to ignore. In academic circles across the US and Europe, a quiet debate began. Was Traore reckless? Or was he revealing the fragility of a global system long overdue for reform? Editorials painted him as a strongman, but human rights observers noted there had been no political purges, no media blackouts, no banned protests. Instead, there was political tension, but also transparency. Still, the American stance remained firm. Officials insisted that IMF structures were essential for global stability. There are rules, one spokesperson said, and they exist for a reason. But for many Africans, those rules had long felt like chains disguised as contracts. A columnist in the New York Times posed the question, if the rules of global finance cannot be questioned, are they truly democratic? The piece went viral, not only in Western capitals, but in African universities, where students debated what it meant to write new rules for themselves. But as financial pressure mounted and new alliances formed, the question turned from policy to principle. Could Burkina Faso and its partners truly rewrite the global order? Or would the system crush them before the ink dried? As economic pressure escalated, Burkina Faso did not respond with retreat. It responded with formation. Traore called an emergency session of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, summoning leaders from Mali and Niger. Their response was immediate. Your gold is our fight too. With that, a regional doctrine was born, not on paper, but in purpose. No longer would each nation guard its sovereignty alone. The seizure of one country's gold was seen as a strike against all. The proposal was as daring as it was symbolic. Build a regional gold reserve, housed in fortified vaults across the Sahel, guarded not by foreign contractors, but by their own soldiers. Why, asked Traore, should the backbone of our future be stored in foreign vaults protected by foreign guns? The question resonated deeply. For decades, African wealth had flown out under contracts written in Brussels or Washington. Now, the Sahel proposed that this wealth stay home, visible, protected, and uncollateralized. Military engineers from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso began site surveys. Locations were chosen not just for security, but for symbolism. Vaults carved into rock, visible from roads, schools, and homes. The message was clear. This gold belongs to the people, and it is guarded by those sworn to defend them. Community involvement surged. Farmers donated grain to feed troops at construction sites. Miners volunteered their skills. Civilians formed protective rings around the vault perimeters during ceremonial groundbreakings. This was not merely a financial infrastructure, it was a psychological one. It told every citizen, you are not defenseless. The West, alarmed by the optics, responded with veiled warnings. Analysts described the move as militarization of resources. Editorials warned of gold nationalism. But for the people of the Sahel, it was not nationalism. It was survival. They remembered how foreign security forces had protected extractive industries for years, guarding profits, not people. Instead, AES forces were trained not just in defense, but in ethics. Officers swore oaths to protect not only gold, but the dignity of their citizens. "This is not just about metal," one general said. "This is about sovereignty with boots on the ground." But how long could these vaults stand untouched when the hands that once controlled Africa's gold now find themselves locked out? What began as a dispute over 300 million in gold has now drawn the outlines of something far larger. A battle not just over resources, but over rules, meaning, and memory. In the corridors of power from Brussels to Washington, concerns have turned to strategy. Sanctions have tightened. Intelligence reports hint at covert operations, funding opposition movements, and quietly pressuring neighboring governments to withdraw support. The aim is no longer to reclaim the gold. It is to fracture the idea it now represents. But the question is no longer economic. It is existential. Can the idea of African financial self-determination survive when the global order is designed to resist it? Will the alliance of Sahel states stand together when tested by not only external force, but internal doubt? History warns us. Great awakenings are often followed by great retaliation. And yet, there is something different this time. Across villages and capital cities alike, people have begun to imagine a future not defined by debt, but by dignity. Not imposed contracts, but mutual agreements. Not vaults in Europe, but in the heart of Africa. It is fragile. It is uncertain, but it has begun. Captain Traoré said it plainly. If we bend today, our children will have nothing left to guard tomorrow. His words echo not just across Burkina Faso, but across every place where people have questioned whose rules they live by. Sovereignty, after all, is not a gift handed down by global institutions. It is a choice, and like every meaningful choice, it comes with a cost. So now we must ask, is this the moment where Africa rewrites its contract with the world? Or will history repeat itself? Another hopeful chapter torn out before it could be finished. If this story moved you, if you believe that gold should build futures, not pay for chains, then don't just watch in silence. Subscribe not just to this channel, but to a deeper truth, one that says freedom is not negotiated in boardrooms, but protected in the hearts of those who still believe. Share your thoughts below, stand with dignity, and may God bless Africa, the land of strength, of hope, and of unbreakable will.